I am dead, and yet I speak to you. This is the confession the hero makes in every myth that has ever mattered. Not the declaration of triumph, not the golden victory cry from atop the mountain. The confession. The dark admission that the one who set out is not the one who returned, and that the self who returned is in some essential way already finished, already spent, already consumed by what it dared to confront. Joseph Campbell spent his life tracking this pattern across 5,000 years of human storytelling, and what he found beneath every surface of cultural difference was not a celebration, it was a funeral. The hero, in the deepest reading of the myth, must always die, and not metaphorically, not symbolically in some comfortable literary sense. The death must be real within the architecture of the psyche. It must cost something that cannot be recovered. We have forgotten this. Modern culture presents the hero as an entertainment product. We watch him win, consume the spectacle of his triumph, and then return to our lives unchanged. The hero dies on screen, and we applaud the special effects. We have turned the most sacred psychological instruction our ancestors encoded into story into a form of anesthesia. We consume the myth of transformation to avoid undergoing transformation ourselves. We have inherited the shell of the archetype and abandoned its marrow. Carl Gustav Jung, in his late writings, returned again and again to a terrifying observation. He said that Western civilization had undergone a kind of spiritual inflation, a swelling of the ego that had mistaken consciousness for the totality of the psyche. We believed we had conquered the inner darkness the way we believed we had conquered the natural world. We built our rational cathedrals high enough that we could no longer see the roots reaching down into the underground. And the underground, Jung warned, does not disappear because it is ignored. It accumulates pressure, it waits. It prepares its enantiodromia, that ancient principle borrowed from Heraclitus, the reversal where the thing carried too far becomes its own opposite. The civilization that worshipped heroic progress too absolutely was preparing, within its own depths, the conditions for heroic collapse. This is not a comfortable subject. It was never meant to be. The death of the hero is not a tragedy to be mourned and moved past. It is an initiation, and tonight we are going to descend into it. Before we can understand what the death of the hero means, we must understand what the hero is. Not the pop-cultural avatar in a cape, the archetypal hero, the figure whose specific function is to venture beyond the boundaries of the known, confront what lives in the dark, and return bearing something that transforms the community. This is not a description of courage in any casual sense. It is a description of a psychological movement, a deliberate willingness to allow the ego to be broken open by forces greater than itself. Every culture that has ever existed created its own version of this figure. The Sumerians gave us Gilgamesh, the two-thirds divine king who roared across the ancient world in the full glory of his power until the death of his beloved Enkidu cracked him at the foundation. Enkidu was his shadow, his animal other, the wildness that civilization had not yet managed to domesticate. When Enkidu died, Gilgamesh was not simply grieving a friend. He was grieving the part of himself he had refused to fully integrate. The wound was not external, it was ontological. It pointed directly at the fracture inside the self that heroic action had been papering over. The Greeks, centuries later, handed us Achilles. And Achilles is perhaps the most honest portrait of heroic psychology that has ever been committed to verse. Homer does not give us a saint. He gives us a man who is catastrophically gifted and catastrophically brittle, a warrior whose strength is inseparable from his wound. The heel is not merely a physical vulnerability. In the symbolic grammar of myth, the heel is the point where the divine failed to fully incarnate into the human. Achilles was dipped into immortality but held by the one place that kept him tethered to death. His tragedy was not that he was mortal. His tragedy was that he could not accept his mortality. He raged against it. He performed his heroism with such manic intensity because, at the unconscious level, every act of glory was an attempt to outrun the heel, to outrun the knowledge that he would die young and that the glory would not prevent the dying. This psychological structure, the hero as one who is simultaneously empowered and wounded by the same source, is not an accident of narrative convention. It is a precise description of how the psyche initiates its own deeper development. Jung would call this the wound that opens the path to individuation, the breakdown that is actually the prerequisite for breakthrough. The German mystic Meister Eckhart, writing in the 13th century with language that anticipated depth psychology by 600 years, said something extraordinary. He said that the soul must be willing to be abandoned by God before it can know God directly, not the God of consolation, not the comfort-giving deity of popular religion, the numinous ground of being itself, which does not announce itself gently. It arrives like a catastrophe. It arrives like the thing that destroys what you were so that you can become what you need to be. Dostoevsky understood this with every nerve of his body. In 1849, the young writer stood blindfolded in a courtyard in St. Petersburg, waiting to be shot. The Tsar's mock execution, a theatrical punishment designed to shatter the revolutionary spirit, lasted only seconds before the order to stand down was given. But those seconds did something to Dostoevsky that no amount of comfortable literary development ever could. They showed him the exact outline of the abyss. They removed every conceptual buffer between him and the fact of death. And when he staggered away from that courtyard, he carried inside him the absolute knowledge that consciousness was a miracle that could be extinguished without ceremony, without meaning, without warning. This knowledge became the animating wound of every character he ever created. Prince Mishkin, Ivan Karamazov, Raskolnikov, each of them is a man who has stared directly into the groundlessness of existence and is attempting to build some kind of meaning on the rubble. Each of them is, in the deepest sense, a wounded hero. None of them succeed entirely. That is precisely the point. The wounding is not optional. This must be said plainly. Every tradition that has taken the development of the human soul seriously has insisted on this. The alchemists called it the nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction. Before the philosopher's stone could be created, the prima materia, the raw, unformed substance of the soul, had to be reduced to its lowest state. It had to rot. The alchemical texts are filled with imagery of death, of ravens, of skulls, of darkness so total it extinguishes the light of ordinary consciousness. This was not pessimism. It was a map. The alchemists were encoding in chemical metaphor the same truth that the shamans of Siberia taught by sending their initiates into the frozen wilderness alone, the same truth that the mystery religions of Eleusis dramatized through descent into an underground chamber. Before the resurrection, the death. Before the gold, the blackness. Before the hero can return transformed, the hero must genuinely die. Let us turn up the volume on this idea. Let us bring in the voices that echo across the centuries and say the same unspeakable thing in different tongues. Friedrich Nietzsche, in 1882, placed these words in the mouth of a madman running through the marketplace with a lantern in broad daylight. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. Most readings of this passage stop at the provocation. They hear the atheist's declaration of triumph and miss entirely the madman's terror. The madman is not celebrating. He is screaming. He is asking whether we have any idea what we have done. He goes on to describe the cosmos as coming unmoored, the horizon being wiped away, and the earth unchained from its sun. These are not the images of liberation. They are the images of vertigo. They describe a universe that has lost its orienting center, and a psyche that has destroyed the structure around which it organized its experience of meaning, and has not yet discovered what can replace it. Nietzsche was diagnosing a cultural event that had been building for centuries. The slow erosion of the sacred canopy that once stretched over Western civilization, the systematic dismantling of myth by Enlightenment rationalism, and the replacement of the numinous with the measurable, of ritual with procedure, and of gnosis with information. And the result was not, as the architects of modernity had promised, a humanity freed to achieve its fullest potential. The result was what he called nihilism, not simply the philosophical position that nothing has value. the lived experience of spiritual emptiness, the morning after the long festival of rational progress, when the decorations had been taken down and the crowd had dispersed, and there was nothing left in the square but silence and the faint smell of something that had been burned. Jung read Nietzsche with the eyes of a psychologist and heard in his work something that Nietzsche himself could not fully articulate. The death of God in modern consciousness did not simply eliminate a metaphysical concept. It eliminated the container, the collective mythological vessel within which the energy of the numinous had been held, organized, and made accessible to the human psyche without destroying it. When that vessel shattered, the numinous did not disappear. It regressed. It descended into the unconscious of individuals and of cultures, where it continued to exert its immense pressure without the civilizing filtration of symbol and ritual. What had once been channeled upward through prayer, through pilgrimage, through the carefully maintained structures of liturgy and festival and sacred drama, now moved underground. And underground forces, as any geologist or any honest depth psychologist will tell you, do not simply dissipate. They build pressure. They find new channels. They erupt. The 20th century was the eruption. 2 world wars generated with industrial precision. Totalitarian ideologies that offered the masses a secular version of the numinous experience, the oceanic feeling of belonging to something vast and absolute and beyond individual responsibility. The specific madness of Nazism, which Jung analyzed in a remarkable 1936 essay with barely concealed alarm, was not an aberration of the German national character. It was the return of the repressed. It was the Wotan archetype, the ancient Norse god of storm and ecstasy and war, rising through the cracks left by centuries of Christian repression and Enlightenment rationalism, and inhabiting an entire culture that had no psychological tools left to recognize or resist possession by an archetypal force. The death of God, when it is not met by the difficult, slow, individual work of finding what lies beneath the God image within one's own psyche, does not produce freedom. It produces possession. The energy does not disappear. It simply finds a new host. Herein lies the specific tragedy of the heroic archetype in the modern world. The hero was always, at the mythological level, the figure who traveled consciously into the realm of these vast forces. Who encountered them, negotiated with them, was transformed by them, and returned bearing that transformation as a gift. The hero was the mechanism by which the individual ego could be renewed through contact with the archetypal depths. He was the membrane between the world above and the world below, and we have broken the membrane. We have abolished the ritual structures through which the heroic descent could be performed in a culturally supported, psychologically meaningful way. We have left individuals with all the pressure of the archetypal realm pushing against them from below, and no map, no guide, no container, no elder at the threshold to say, yes, this is the door. Here is how you go through it without losing yourself entirely. The initiatory traditions of indigenous cultures understood something about this that academic psychology is only beginning to recover. The adolescent male who was taken into the wilderness by the elders, stripped of his name, subjected to physical ordeal, left alone in the dark with the sounds of predators and the vast indifferent sky above him, was not being punished. He was being killed. The boy was being killed so that the man could be born. The death was real within the psychic economy of the ritual. The terror was intentional. The elders did not comfort the initiate through the night. They maintained the ritual space so that the encounter with groundlessness could do its work. And what it produced was not simply toughness. It produced a man who had been to the bottom and come back. A man who knew from experience, not from theory, that he could survive the dissolution of his previous self. A man who carried within him the living knowledge that death was not the end but the passage. We do not do this anymore. We do not send our young people into the symbolic wilderness with elders who know the territory. We send them into institutions optimized for the production of functional economic units, and we wonder why an entire generation is collapsing under the weight of anxiety and meaninglessness. We have given them everything except the one thing the soul requires, which is genuine encounter with its own depth. We have protected them from every difficulty and left them utterly unequipped for the existential darkness that life will inevitably deliver. The death of the hero in the cultural imagination has not eliminated the need for initiation. It has simply left that need unmet, festering, turning back on the individual as depression, as addiction, as the frantic and joyless pursuit of stimulation that is the modern substitute for genuine experience of the numinous. Let us go deeper still. Let us consider the alchemical concept of the mortificatio, the death of the substance in the crucible. The alchemists observed that when certain materials were subjected to heat beyond a certain threshold, they underwent a transformation so complete that the original substance seemed to vanish entirely. What remained bore no resemblance to what had been placed in the vessel. This, they said, was not destruction. It was the liberation of the essential nature that had been bound up and hidden within the crude form. The gold was always there. The process of the nigredo, the blackening, and the mortificatio was the removal of everything that was not gold. Psychologically, this is a description of what happens when the hero genuinely confronts and is defeated by the shadow. The shadow, in Jungian terms, is not simply the repository of what is morally reprehensible in the personality. It is far more interesting and far more demanding than that. The shadow is the sum of everything that has been excluded from the conscious self-image. The qualities that were too threatening, too inconvenient, too incompatible with the persona, the social mask, to be admitted into the light of ordinary consciousness. These things do not disappear when they are repressed. They consolidate in the dark, they acquire energy from the psychic pressure of suppression, and they return. They always return. In projection, in compulsion, in the enemy you cannot stop thinking about, because something in you recognizes in him the face of what you cannot admit in yourself. The heroic ego, in its inflation, believes it has mastered the shadow. This is precisely the moment of maximum danger. The myths are unambiguous about this. Oedipus, who solved the riddle of the Sphinx and became king of Thebes, was destroyed not by an external enemy but by the truth about himself that he had been running from his entire life. The oracle told him. He refused to hear it. He was clever enough to defeat the monster, but not wise enough to defeat his own certainty that he was not the monster. Hubris, in Greek tragedy, is not simply arrogance in the vulgar sense. It is the specific error of the consciousness that has achieved genuine greatness, and then made the catastrophic mistake of believing that greatness was final, was complete, was the destination rather than a stopping point on a longer road. We arrive now at the question that has been waiting beneath all of this. If the hero must die, if the death is not a tragedy but an initiation, then what is it an initiation into? What is the thing that lies on the other side of the heroic collapse? And more urgently, what does this mean for us, here, now, in a civilization that has forgotten the meaning of initiation? Jung spent the second half of his life attempting to answer exactly this question. The concept he developed to describe what the death of the hero was in service of was individuation. This word, which sounds clinical and academic, points toward something almost impossibly radical. Individuation is not self-improvement. It is not the optimization of the existing personality. It is the process by which the whole person, including everything the ego has excluded, denied, repressed, and projected, is gradually, painfully, necessarily brought into relationship with consciousness. It is the making whole of what has been fractured, and it cannot be accomplished by the heroic ego acting in its heroic mode. This is the paradox at the center of everything. The very capacity that enabled the early stages of the journey, the drive, the will, the conquering energy of the solar hero, is precisely what must be surrendered to make the deeper stages possible. This is why the shamanic traditions the world over describe a moment in the initiation where the spirits, or the divine, or the forces of the underworld, literally dismantle the initiate. They remove the flesh, the organs. They replace the bones with new material. They are rebuilding from the inside out, and the old structure must be completely disassembled before the new one can be installed. This is not metaphor dressed up as fact. It is psychological fact expressed in the only language that could contain its full weight, which is the language of myth and image and overwhelming experience. The person who survives this process is not the same person who entered it. The word survivor is already wrong because it implies the continuous existence of the same individual through a difficult passage. What actually happens is closer to what the Sufi poet Rumi was describing when he wrote about the reed's cry, the longing of the instrument to return to the reed bed from which it was cut. The music is only possible because of the wound. The separation is what creates the capacity for the song. The alchemical equivalent is the phoenix, not the bird of resurrection in the popular sense, not the cheerful symbol of comeback and renewal. The real phoenix, in the alchemical texts, burned to ash at a temperature that left nothing, not a sleeping form, not a dormant seed. Ash, complete dissolution. And from that ash, not the same bird in a new coat of feathers, but a new order of being that had been generated within the combustion itself. The philosopher's stone, the goal of the great work, was not external to the process of putrefaction and combustion. It was produced by them. You could not reach it by going around the fire. You could only reach it by going through. What does this look like in actual psychological life? Not in myth, not in alchemy, not in tribal initiation, but in the lived experience of a contemporary person confronting the death of what they thought they were? It looks like the executive who has spent 30 years building a successful career around the identity of the competent, rational, controlled achiever, and who one morning finds himself sitting in his car in a parking garage, unable to move, unable to think, unable to perform the next action in the chain of performances that has constituted his life. It looks like the collapse of the persona, the sudden and terrifying recognition that the role has been played for so long that the actor has forgotten there was ever a separate self beneath the role. The numbness that follows is not depression in the clinical sense, though it may wear depression's clothing. It is the nigredo. It is the blackening. It is the soul's announcement that the old structure has served its purpose and must now be released. It looks like the moment in Dante's life that opens the Commedia, that most comprehensive map of the psychological underworld ever produced. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita. In the middle of the journey of our life, I found myself in a dark wood where the straight way was lost. Dante was not describing a spiritual crisis in the abstract. He was describing a specific moment of collapse at midlife, when the heroic self-narrative that had carried him forward suddenly lost its coherence. The wood is not a place of defeat. It is a place of necessary disorientation, because Virgil, the guide, can only arrive once the maps are gone. The wisdom that can lead through the underworld cannot be consulted while the ego still believes it knows the way. It looks like Tolstoy's Ivan Ilyich, a man who arranged his entire life with impeccable rationality and social correctness, and who in his final illness discovered that the life he had so carefully constructed had been, in its essential truth, a lie, not because he had done terrible things, because he had never truly inhabited his own existence. He had managed his life from a distance. He had optimized the surface and never once descended to ask what was beneath it. And the death that comes for him comes not only as the termination of his body, but as the revelation of everything he failed to be. It is a revelation that arrives too late, or almost too late. In the very last pages, in the final hours, something in Ivan Ilyich breaks open. The heroic self-management fails completely, and, in the space that opens when it fails, something raw and real and unprecedented becomes possible. The death of the hero is, in Tolstoy's extraordinary final vision, the birth of the genuine human being. This is what the myths have been trying to tell us across millennia. The heroic mode of consciousness, however necessary and however genuinely great its achievements, is not the destination. It is the vehicle that takes you to the threshold. At the threshold, the vehicle must be left behind. The crossing cannot be made in the armor. The armor is what prevents the crossing. And modernity, with its compulsive glorification of the heroic ego, with its ceaseless production of content celebrating will and drive and achievement and the triumphant, unconquerable individual self, is a civilization that has enshrined the vehicle and demolished the threshold. We are a culture permanently suspended at the moment before the necessary death, permanently performing the heroism that is only valuable insofar as it is preparing us for its own surrender. The philosopher Martin Heidegger, in his dense and demanding way, said something that becomes luminous when placed alongside everything we have been discussing. He said that the fundamental condition of authentic human existence is being toward death. Not the avoidance of death, not the management of death, not the distraction from death, but the constant, living, honest orientation toward the fact of one's own finitude. He argued that it is precisely this orientation that liberates the individual from the das Man, the anonymous they of social conformity, the endless, faceless, unstoppable pressure to live the life that one lives, to want what one wants, to fear what one fears. Only when you have genuinely taken death into your self-understanding does your existence become, in Heidegger's term, authentic, genuinely your own, shaped by your actual situation, rather than by the collective avoidance of what that situation actually contains. This is not morbidity, this is gnosis, the direct, lived, non-theoretical knowing of what you are and what you are inside of. Every mystical tradition that has produced genuine wisdom has placed this knowing at the center of its practice. The Tibetan Buddhist traditions developed an entire art form around the conscious confrontation with death. The Bardo Thodol, the text read to the dying to guide consciousness through the dissolution of the familiar self-structure into the luminous ground beneath it. The Egyptian Book of the Dead performed a similar function, providing the soul with the knowledge it needed to navigate the underworld, not as a victim of its terrors, but as a conscious traveler who recognized each encounter for what it was. The Eleusinian Mysteries, the most sacred and most carefully guarded initiatory rites of ancient Greece, seem to have centered on precisely this experience, the simulation of death so vivid and complete that the initiate emerged knowing, not believing, not hoping, but knowing that what they were was not confined to the body that would one day be placed in the earth. What was transmitted in those underground chambers that can no longer be transmitted because the chambers are archaeological sites and the rites have been replaced by conference halls and productivity seminars. It was the experiential knowledge that the self is larger than the ego believes it to be, that the ground floor of the psyche is not the bottom, that beneath the heroic individual with his narrative and his achievements and his carefully managed self-presentation is an ocean of depth that the heroic individual has been, all along, floating on top of without knowing it. The ego, from the perspective of the deep psyche, is like a figure carved on the prow of a great ship, convinced that it is driving. The myth of the hero is the story of how that figure eventually learns what is actually doing the moving. We must speak now, plainly and without comfort, about what the failure to undergo this death produces. A man who has never had his heroic identity genuinely threatened does not become a fully realized human being. He becomes, instead, an inflated ego that will eventually collapse under the weight of the reality it has been refusing. The inflation itself becomes the enemy. Jung identified this pattern with devastating precision in his study of what he called the puer aeternus, the eternal youth archetype, the young man who refuses to descend from the brilliant air of potential into the demanding soil of actual, embodied life. The puer is charming, inspired, full of promise. He has genuine gifts. He simply cannot allow those gifts to be tested by commitment, by difficulty, by the sustained, unglamorous work of carrying something through its dark middle phases. Because the middle phases are where the heroic narrative falls apart. They are where the music stops and the silence asks its question, and the puer runs from that question. He runs toward the next beginning, the next inspiration, the next version of himself that has not yet been made uncomfortable by its own limitations. This is not a description of personal weakness. It is a description of a cultural pathology. We live in a civilization that has structurally optimized for the perpetuation of the pure psychology. We have built an information environment designed to produce constant novelty and to prevent the sustained attention that depth requires. We have created economic and social systems that reward surface performance and punish the periods of withdrawal and darkness that the process of genuine development actually requires. We have, in effect, constructed a collective environment that makes individuation structurally difficult, not because anyone planned it that way, because the cumulative result of millions of individual choices made from the same unconscious avoidance of groundlessness adds up to a world that is itself a monument to the refusal of depth. The result is what we see, an epidemic of what the philosopher Albert Camus, in his extraordinary meditation on the absurd, described with the word he considered the most important in his vocabulary: revolt. Not rebellion in the political sense. The inner refusal to accept that life as it is presented by the universe is life as it must be accepted. The refusal to make one's peace with the groundlessness, the absurdity, the sheer radical contingency of human existence. Camus was not a pessimist, though he is often read as one. He was insisting that the confrontation with the absurd, with the silence of the universe in the face of the human need for meaning, was not the end of the inquiry. It was the necessary starting point. He was insisting on the death of the heroic narrative as the precondition for authentic existence. Sisyphus, in Camus' remarkable reframing, must be imagined happy not because his situation has improved, but because he has fully accepted what his situation is. The heroic project of rolling the stone up the hill has been abandoned in favor of something deeper, a consciousness that accompanies its own absurdity with open eyes and finds, in that accompaniment, a form of freedom that no amount of triumphant stone rolling ever provided. The ghost, in the psychological sense, is what a person becomes when they refuse this passage, the one who keeps performing the identity that died long ago because they have no relationship with what might replace it. We are haunted, as individuals and as a culture, by the ghosts of heroic identities that have outlived their psychological usefulness, the ghost of the self-made man, the ghost of the conquering nation, the ghost of the rational subject who masters nature and history through the sheer force of his intellectual will. These are heroic archetypes that served their purpose at a specific moment in the development of Western consciousness, and that have since died, and that we are carrying around inside us as corpses, animating them with frantic cultural energy because the alternative, acknowledging the death and asking what it is making way for, is a descent we have collectively decided we cannot afford. But the descent is not optional. That is the terrible and liberating truth that every tradition we have been drawing on tonight is converging to say. The descent is not optional. Only its timing and its quality are within our control. We can descend consciously, guided by the symbolic wisdom of those who have mapped the underworld, or we can wait until life delivers the descent without our consent. And when the descent comes without consent, without preparation, without the knowledge that this is initiation and not annihilation, the psyche is in genuine danger, not of weakness, of fragmentation, of the specific modern form of spiritual catastrophe that presents itself as psychiatric disorder, as addiction, as the violent acting out of a shadow that was never integrated, as the collective pathologies that Jung saw building in the Europe of the 1930s and that we can see building again in the present moment in ways that would not have surprised him in the least. And now, after all of this, after the dismantling, after the nigredo, after the long dark night in the alchemical vessel, we must ask the question that justifies the suffering. What does the dead hero know? What does he know that the living hero, the triumphant, armor-bright, flag-bearing hero of the first half of the journey, could not access? This is the question that Dante's journey answers. This is the question that the Grail legend, in its deepest reading, was designed to transmit. The Grail is not a cup. It is not a relic. It is the symbol of the capacity to hold the suffering of existence without looking away, without aestheticizing it from a safe distance, and without converting it into a narrative that confirms the hero's greatness. The question that Parsifal must learn to ask, whom does the Grail serve, is not a riddle with a clever answer. It is the question that the ego, in its heroic mode, structurally cannot ask, because the heroic ego is organized around the premise that it serves itself. The answer to the question, which Parsifal only discovers after he has been stripped of his certainties and wandered for years in the wasteland of his own incomprehension, is simply this: the Grail serves the one who is suffering. The capacity for genuine compassion, not sympathetic emotion from a safe distance, but the full, undefended encounter with another's pain, becomes available only after one's own heroic invulnerability has been genuinely defeated. This is the gift that the death of the hero makes possible. Not the end of capability, not the collapse into permanent weakness, the opening of a new mode of being that was not accessible to the heroic consciousness. Jung called this the second half of life, though he was careful to say that many people who are chronologically old never enter it, and some who are young have already found the door. It is characterized by a fundamental reorientation of the relationship between the ego and the unconscious. The ego no longer drives the process, it participates. It learns to listen to what is arising from the depths, rather than imposing its agenda upon it. The work becomes less about achievement and more about reception, less about conquest and more about discernment, less about the accumulation of external proof of one's worth and more about the increasingly direct relationship with what Jung called the self, the totality of the psyche, the inner authority that had been present all along but that could only be heard once the noise of heroic ambition had been sufficiently quieted. This is what the shamans were preparing their initiates for. This is what the mystery religions were transmitting in their underground chambers. This is what the alchemists were encoding in their chemical allegories. The mature human being is not a more successful version of the heroic ego. The mature human being is a fundamentally different structure of consciousness, one in which the ego has been placed in right relationship to the depths from which it arises and to which it will eventually return. A consciousness that can hold paradox rather than resolving it prematurely, that can dwell in uncertainty without collapsing into either dogma or nihilism, that has made its peace with the shadow not by defeating it but by entering into dialogue with it, discovering that what appeared to be the enemy was carrying precisely the qualities the heroic ego had needed and refused. Rilke, writing to a young poet in 1903, offered advice that reads now as a kind of esoteric instruction manual for this exact process. He said that we must live the questions, not seek the answers with the urgency of the heroic mind that must know, must resolve, must achieve closure, but live inside the questions with patience, trusting that one day, far in the future, without even noticing the transition, we will find ourselves living the answers. This is not passivity. It is a completely different quality of active engagement with existence, one that requires more genuine courage than any heroic conquest, because it requires the surrender of the certainty that one knows what one is supposed to be doing. The dead hero knows that the universe is not organized around his narrative. This knowledge, which sounds like defeat when it is first encountered, is in truth the beginning of the only relationship with reality that does not eventually betray itself. Because the universe genuinely is not organized around any individual's narrative, the hero who dies to this truth is not destroyed by it, he is freed by it, freed from the exhausting project of maintaining a self-story in the face of constant evidence that reality is indifferent to self-stories, freed to encounter what is actually present rather than what the narrative requires to be present, freed, in the deepest sense, to be genuinely alive in the way that only becomes possible once one has genuinely reckoned with death. We have traveled, tonight, through the alchemical darkness of the heroic myth. We have sat with Gilgamesh at the death of Enkidu and felt the foundations shake. We have stood in Dostoevsky's courtyard and felt the seconds expand into eternities. We have descended with Dante into the wood where the straight way is lost. We have watched Ivan Ilyich die and open, in his dying, into something neither he nor we expected. We have heard Nietzsche's madman scream in the marketplace and understood, perhaps for the first time, that he was screaming for all of us. The death of the hero is not a modern problem that requires a modern solution. It is the central initiation of the human soul, the one that every genuine wisdom tradition has pointed toward, that every great artist has circled, and that every person who has lived honestly and deeply has eventually been asked to undergo. The question is not whether the death will come. The question is whether we will be prepared to receive it as what it is, not as annihilation, but as the opening of the door that has been standing in the back wall of the psyche since before we were born. That door has no handle on the outside. It opens from within. And it opens specifically at the moment when the heroic self, having exhausted its strategies and spent its arsenal, finally becomes still enough to hear the knock that has been sounding from the other side all along. There is a specific quality of silence that descends when the hero finally stops. Not the silence of defeat, which is loud with self-recrimination. Not the silence of avoidance, which is full of distraction. A genuine silence. The silence of a person who has come to the end of what they know and is now, perhaps for the first time, actually present to what is. In the alchemical tradition, this is the moment called the albedo, the whitening, the dawn that follows the long blackness of the nigredo. It is not yet the gold. The gold is still far ahead, and the journey to it will take everything the traveler has. But in the albedo, in that first cold morning light after the darkness, something has been permanently altered. The traveler knows, in their bones, in their marrow, in the place that is deeper than thought, that the darkness did not kill them, that they went down and they came back, and that this knowledge, this gnosis, this body knowledge of survival through dissolution, is a form of freedom that nothing external can provide or remove. This is what we are being asked to remember, not as information, not as content to be consumed and forgotten, as a living orientation toward our own existence. The death of the hero is not the end of the story. It is the story's first true beginning. Everything before it was the preparation. Everything after it, if we are willing to receive what it offers, is the life we were actually born to live. The shadow is waiting. The underworld has a door. The ancestors who made this journey before us, in every culture and every century that the human soul has been doing its slow and difficult work of waking up, have left us maps in the language of myth and symbol and great art and psychological insight. We are not alone in the dark wood. We never were. The question is only whether we are willing to stop long enough to read the signs.